everyone, it's Annabelle. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about recovering a near rootless or rootless Phalaenopsis orchid, and one that I rescued from my mum at the beginning of the month, and by the end of the month we've got new roots. So I first wanted to start off by explaining a little bit about the situation and how I came to have this orchid and the kind of state that it was in when I first got it compared to now, and how it's recovering. Kind of my thought process behind how I treat a recovering orchid, and also kind of how I keep it while it's recovering, my thoughts on that, and just general kind of chat about this orchid and how it's recovering. So with that said, let's get started and take a closer look at the Phalaenopsis in question. So this is my mum's Phalaenopsis orchid. She struggles a little bit with orchids in general, and Phalaenopsis in particular. She's much better with Cymbidiums and Oncidium types, and I think that's due to the environment that she's keeping them in and the kind of media that she's using. I do kind of give her a little bit of advice, but I kind of try not to intrude and give advice where it's not, you know, where it's not wanted, or it's going to make things a bit more complicated for her, because I don't want to make it into something that she feels like she has to do, or that becomes a chore for her because I'm into orchids. So I try and kind of stay out of it until she asks for a bit of help. And with this one, I went over for dinner one evening and she said, "It's a bit wobbly in the pot, can you have a look at it?" So the situation was, all of the roots that you can see in the pot now were all aerial roots. All of the roots that were in the pot had completely died off, and it just had these little stumps where basically the orchid had tried making new roots and they touched the top of the bark and just stopped growing. And I think that this is a combination of factors. Mum was using the Westland orchid bark, which I really dislike. It's dusty and bitty, and it's more suited to Cymbidiums, I think, than anything else. I really dislike it. Although Oncidiums, I guess it's a replacement for moss, but it's not as airy. It's just kind of a little bit gross. So I don't really like it, and I think that that's the issue here, combined with Mum's environment. She's keeping them on a windowsill. Over winter they do get cooler, so I think that they've just stayed a little bit too soggy in that horrible kind of dusty, bitty mix for too long, and all the roots died off in the pot and the new roots just didn't want to grow into the media. So I'll put some pictures up on screen of when I got it. Initially I folded all of the aerial roots in and soaked them in a seaweed solution with rain mix for about 4 hours. Just to try and get loads of nutrients and water into the orchid. I then kept it bare root in that little container for a while and soaked it for 30 minutes a day for the first few days, just to really try and get moisture in, because when you pot aerial roots there's always a chance that the roots can die off. So before that happens, we want to get as much moisture into the plant as possible and then pot, because the aerial roots will, if they do survive, they will provide continuous moisture and act as a root system for that orchid. And that's what's happened. The aerial roots, I popped them into semi-hydro and they have all survived, and even one is branching in the pot. In addition to this, it's kind of exploded with root growth. So all those little dried tips that didn't make it in Mum's environment have kind of reactivated. We've got some new roots coming out from the stem, which is really great. More coming out around this side, and another dried root activating, and I think that this one probably will at some stage as well, because this looks fairly viable. So this orchid I think is well on the way to recovery. You can see how stressed it was. So I don't know what's happened to this leaf, because Mum doesn't keep them in bright sun at all. They're actually in quite deep shade, and I would say that the light is a bit too low even for Phalaenopsis types. She has cats. Maybe a cat has attacked it at some point. Who knows? But you can see the difference in how kind of perky this leaf is, which is the only real good leaf it had to start with. You can see the stress on the orchid by the leaf size drops. So it's then produced a very tiny leaf. It's then made this leaf, which has perked up a lot since I got it. It was very droopy and floppy when I first got it, obviously from dehydration. And then it's putting out this leaf, which isn't quite finished yet. You can tell when a leaf is finishing on a Phalaenopsis when this appears, this little join. and that means the leaf has finished growing. So this one is still growing. Hopefully it'll get to a reasonable size with the fact that it's now getting moisture and nutrition, and it's developing a new root system. So I think that the outlook for this is very good. And if you consider that I potted this on the 4th of March and we're now at the 31st of March, so we're sort of 27 days later, and that's kind of where we are within a month. And I think that we were very, very fortunate in the fact that the aerial roots were still alive and we were able to use them to get moisture into the plant. Now, if there had been no roots at all, that would be a completely different story. And in that scenario, the best thing to do is to put your orchid in a place where it's reasonably high humidity, there's good air movement, lowish to light to bright shade, so you don't induce light stress, because if you put it into really bright light, it's going to immediately be trying to photosynthesize loads, which will be using up resources it just doesn't have. So you really want to keep it at a kind of maintenance level of photosynthesis. You don't want to heat stress it too much, just kind of a nice medium stress-free environment until it starts making new roots, because if it's not got any roots, you really can't get moisture into the plant. There's no point in soaking the stump of the plant where it's got no roots. All you're going to do is introduce the risk of rot with that sort of situation. Foliar feeding or spraying your orchid, I feel like, I personally don't do this, and I feel like it's a bit of a risky situation. So you're spraying your orchid, it's got no roots, it's probably very dehydrated and with a low immune system. If any water gets into a leaf joint, you're just going to introduce rot, and that is probably very quickly going to kill your orchid. The only nutrient that really, I'm convinced, can be absorbed in any significant quantities by foliar feeding is magnesium, which you can get into the plant by spraying with Epsom salt solution. But I personally feel that the risk outweighs the benefits if your orchid is just dehydrated. If it's looking very yellow and really looking like it's struggling to produce chlorophyll, then yeah, I guess at that point, really, you've not got much to lose. You could probably try foliar feeding with some seaweed and some Epsom salts. I'm not convinced that seaweed actually gets in through the leaves, so I just don't mess around with doing that sort of thing, and I have very good success at recovering orchids. In terms of potting media, if your orchid is rootless, what I would do is balance it in a vase or a cup with a little bit of sphagnum at the bottom to kind of maintain a humid environment around the base of the orchid that has no roots, so that when new root tips do emerge, they're emerging into a nice humid environment, and let them grow until they're sort of 3 or 4 centimeters long, and then you can start kind of giving it little soaks or just start spraying the roots a little bit once a day. But until it's got roots, I wouldn't do anything really. I would just try and keep it as stress-free as possible. I've tried sphagnum bag methods before, which is where you place some damp sphagnum moss into a bag and you seal the bag, and that creates a very humid environment, which is going to reduce water loss through the leaves through transpiration. So it's going to stop your orchid losing water while it can't take it up, or losing so much water at least. And I've just had rot issues whenever I've tried that, so I wouldn't recommend doing that, but lots of people find it successful, so I guess whatever works for you, but I wouldn't want to personally recommend that to anyone because I can't do it. So I just keep my orchids in a kind of low stress environment, lowish light, reasonable humidity around them, good airflow, and try and keep a more humid environment around the roots, which is why I've kind of potted this one. You can see the base isn't touching the media because that can cause rot issues, and it didn't have any roots coming out of the base, it just had the aerial roots which were coming out of the side, which I potted. So I've kind of got it elevated, and then the actual leca I've put quite low down in the pot so that I don't have a dry top layer right here to desiccate the roots. Hopefully that will stay a little bit more moist when they do get down into the media. So I'm just going to show you where I actually keep my orchid, but first we're going to talk about the nutrient soak that I give it while it's recovering. So I use seaweed. If people ask me for a recipe or what levels I put of things, and I really can't generalize this, so seaweed varies massively in terms of quality and purity of the active growth hormones in it. Different brands will have different amounts, so you really just kind of need to go, I would go by what the manufacturer says. Feed a low dose at every watering though. So for this one, germinating and propagating, it says 10 ml and 9 litres or 20 ml and 9 litres. And for transplanting, it says 20 ml and 9 litres. So I tend to go for the 20 ml and 9 litres kind of ratio for new orchids or orchids that are struggling, and then drop it down for my regular feed every time. Rain mix, I go in quite high with the initial soak. This has got calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in, so it's like a complete feed. I go in quite high to start with, then quite honestly I then just water with my regular nutrient solution once I've done those initial soaks and potted the orchid up. So I'm just going to show you where I keep orchids that are kind of recovering so that you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about in terms of light levels. So this is in my orchid room. This little shelf is my setup for seedlings and recovering orchids. It's the bottom shelf of my Vanda racking, so it gets filtered light from above as well as a single cool white under-counter LED strip light that I have, which is not particularly powerful, but it just gives it enough light to kind of keep them going. So it's providing a kind of stress-free but still bright light environment that they can kind of recover well into. It has a heat mat on here. So as you'll see, the racking is actually wire racking, so the heat will dissipate from below. So it's not going to build up and cook the orchids, which would induce more stress if we're keeping it in a really hot environment. It just helps to keep the clay media nice and warm during winter. During summer I wouldn't use this heat mat because clay media stays cooler than average temperatures because of the evaporative cooling effect. So we kind of just want to keep them nice and evenly warm, evenly moist, not too much heat or light stress, so that they are obviously just in a nice kind of comfortable environment where they can recover easily in. My humidity in this room over winter tends to be kind of 70% plus, but over the last month that we're talking about for this orchid is averaging about 50 to 60% humidity. My humidity does drop over summer. Temperatures, I can just flick this between Celsius and Fahrenheit, but I would say over the last month we've averaged between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius. The minimum and maximum you can see here is over the entire winter period, so including a night when there was no power and hotter days. So at the moment we're keeping it kind of 20 to 25 Celsius, which I think is probably 65 to 80 Fahrenheit. Not sure off the top of my head, but humidity stays around 60%. I have a fan at the edge of this shelf, just a little mini USB fan, which just helps to provide air movement and circulation so that there are no rot issues, because I think that's really important if you are keeping the humidity a little bit higher, especially for recovering orchids, because that'll reduce the moisture that they're losing through the leaves if the humidity is higher, and encourage them to produce new roots along with good nutrients and obviously good light, but not so bright that it's going to stress the orchid. I think this kind of setup is quite easy to replicate in any kind of home environment. The humidity side of things I think it is quite important for recovering orchids, so if you can't keep the humidity higher, if you can place a humidifier somewhere near them, as long as you've got good air movement, or humidity trays, just try and get the humidity in the environment up a little bit. But putting them into a vase or a cup with a little bit of moss at the bottom will help a little bit as well if you keep the moss kind of evenly moist. That's my kind of recovering orchid setup. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you found it useful today. Leave any comments down below with any questions and I'll do my best to answer as always. And thank you so much for watching today. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like or subscribe to my channel for regular orchid updates. And I'll see you guys later. Bye!